Thank you for joining us for our webinar on emergency preparedness and response. This is a six-part series. This program today is the second in that six-part series, and the focus is building your plan. The program is brought to you by the Florida Association of Museums Foundation and Florida Humanities. I want to thank our partners today, which includes Florida Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, FEMA's Heritage Emergency National Task Force, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, Cultural Builds Florida, Florida Department of State, Division of Cultural Affairs, Visit Florida, Cure Collections Care, LLC, Florida Museum, and the Society of Florida Archivists. Funding for this program is provided by a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I want to welcome our staff here today. Carolyn Tharp-Weiss is our membership and financial manager. She's helping us out with some technical pieces. My name is Carmen Godwin. I'm the FAM Foundation program manager. The webinar today is being recorded. And our agenda is that we have two segments. Our speaker will focus on two different topics. Between those topics, we will have two segments of a Q&A. You can type your question in the chat box anytime during the program as you think of it. Or during the Q&A, you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Rebecca. Finally, there's a breakout session where you will interact with your colleagues. We'll propose a question and you'll go into a breakout room and talk through that question with them. And we'll explain more about that later. We have some resource links that we will provide to you in the chat box. You have the ability to save the chat box history, and those links, you can go back and look at those later. Also, we will be sending you a survey after the program. When I send that email, it will include a lot of resources as well as a video recording of this program. And we just ask that you take 3 minutes to fill out the survey. It not only helps us understand what you thought about this program, but it helps us understand what programs you like to see in the future. We are developing our programs for next year based on the feedback that you provide in these surveys. So please take just a moment to complete that for us. Now I want to welcome our speaker. Rebecca Kennedy is Collections Care Specialist at Cure Collections Care. She founded this in 2018. She's worked in Florida museums and was a collections manager and preservation specialist at the Smithsonian Institution for 11 years. She received a certification in first aid to cultural heritage in times of crisis, and she is the chair of the Association of Registrars and Collections Specialists Emergency Committee. She has responded to institutional emergencies as well as national emergencies, and she's provided training on preparedness for all types of institutions and sizes of institutions throughout the country. So we are very thankful to have her here today. I am going to turn off my screen and start sharing with Rebecca right now. So thank you and welcome, Rebecca.
So today we're going to discuss building your emergency plan. I just want to emphasize that this can seem like an overwhelming process, but it's very easy to do if you have all the right tools. So we're going to go over the different parts of an emergency plan today in order to prepare you for writing your own. So we often get the question like, why do I need an emergency plan? And I've listed some of the options here, but one of the things it really does is it's an official document that promotes preparedness, allows for resiliency. It can even improve the security in total of the cultural institution. But I'm not going to read all of these to you because I want you to read them for yourself. But I want to point out this last point that it integrates your institution into local, state, and national emergency plans. When you write an emergency plan, if you're part of a bigger organization, it should be able to integrate easily. You should be able to provide copies and allow everyone to see what you're prepared for and how that fits into their larger role. So having this integration really improves your response. The resource I have pictured up here is the Be Prepared from the Heritage Collection Council in Australia. And it is one of my favorite resources for preparing or writing an emergency plan. So this is a free resource and it is listed in the resource provided by Carmen. To write your emergency plan, you need to use your risk assessments. The risk assessments help you identify hazards, vulnerability, and impact, and who's going to engage with these risks. Is it going to be institution staff, contractors, or outside representatives? But using your risk assessment to really understand what your hazards are helps you focus your emergency plan on what is most important. So the emergency plan focuses on people, services, places, and by places it could be your museum itself, your storage facility, if you have multiple branches or a historic home on your property, or even an offsite storage facility. So places can be anything. And then also it should talk about supplies. What supplies do you need to respond to emergency? And I'll go over that a little bit more later. I first want to start off by mentioning some digital tools that are available to you. The first one is D-Plan. D-Plan is currently using a 2006 version with an update coming hopefully next year. It is an online tool where you sort of have to find all the information still, plug it into the software, and it produces an emergency plan. This is a great tool to utilize, but it's not personalized to your institution fully. So I would still recommend writing one from scratch, but if you really need a helping hand, D-Plan is available to you. The other resource is the Pocket Response Plan, or PREP, by the Council of State Archivists. This is actually not really an emergency plan. This is a quick reference tool, and you can customize it to list your call list, initial response procedures, and so forth. It's really small, and it actually folds to like fit inside behind your ID badge or in your wallet, someplace where you will always have it on you. These are both free resources, so I'm always a big fan of using whatever tools are available to you. So the sections or chapters of an emergency plan are listed here. We're actually going to go into each one of these more in details, but I just wanted to kind of show you what these chapters are going to look like. So I'm going to start with the introduction. The first half of your emergency plan is all about people. People always want to know what their role is. What do they have to do? How does this affect them? Which is a fine question to ask because people are the responders. People are the ones who use the space day to day. So the first half, we're going to talk a lot about what people need to respond to an emergency. And then the second half will go into what the objects need, which are always secondary to life, safety, and people. So you should always start your emergency plan with an introduction. Sounds basic, but people often get overwhelmed of what should go into one. Ultimately, your introduction is like an executive summary. We have to know what to expect in the document. So feel free to write it last, just like you would an executive summary. So what does an introduction include? We need to understand that management is supporting this document. It's all about buy-in and advocacy. Why are these people supporting it? Who is the ultimate authority that can approve it? And this is why you should listen to them. Many organizations, especially larger ones, set up emergency teams that kind of oversee the emergency preparedness and mitigation at their institution. And those can even be the lead writers on this, but we just need to make sure you understand that management is supporting this. You also need to list any policies or plans that you have that are going to actually support this document. This is often your collections management policy, any sort of risk management policy. If you're part of an institution, such as a university or a large library system, your parent institution probably has an emergency plan that needs to be also incorporated. So just listing those out, being like, this fully supports my collections management policy, or based on my collections management policy, we are doing risk assessment, things like that. Use that to actually put more oomph and weight into your introduction. List the names and positions of people who are working on the plan. You need to know who wrote it, and it gives a little bit of authorship, but it also should show that this was not done by a singular person, and we'll go into that a little bit more, but there should be a team that writes this plan. Then you need a brief summary of what the plan will cover. And again, I'm talking brief. Obviously, the plan's going to cover emergencies, but you need to sort of put it in a more comprehensive language, like, we're going to respond to emergencies inherent to our institution, and this is why it's important. And how it's going to be used is we're going to use it when there's an emergency that it specifically affects our collections. Very simple. Don't overthink it. Just make it sound very buy-in. That's what we're looking for. Complete buy-in. So next, we move on to roles and responsibilities. Again, this is all about people. People want to know what their role is. So this gets a little heavy, but this is very important, and we'll work on this later as well. So there are basic types of roles of people that respond to an emergency, and they should be addressed and acknowledged in your emergency plan. And what I mean by that is that we have to actually follow what's called the incident command system. And all of these fall underneath the incident command system. I've just given them names that work for a cultural institution. So the team leader, incident commander, is usually the person who leads it. Obviously, it's very simple in the title. There's also the safety coordinator. I always put in a safety coordinator when I'm making these plans, because somebody needs to make sure everyone is safe. And we'll go a little bit more into safety, because if people aren't safe, the emergency becomes much more complex. You also need to think about the roles of contractors, first responders. What is the role of communications? And then you get down to the response teams, such as salvage, retrieval, triage, documentation, and more. Ultimately, it kind of looks like this. This is the incident command system as it exists and is used by the federal, local, and state governments, including first responders. But I've just changed the titles to fit for a cultural institution. When you go through and start listing people's roles, people always want to make these spots somebody's name or position. But what you need to do is actually create these roles based on an emergency. So there will always be, according to this chart, a collections coordinator. That collections coordinator could change throughout the years, but you'll always have a collections coordinator. And you can always add a table right before or after this chart showing that person who is going to be the collections coordinator right now, the person who's the facilities coordinator, and their contact information. You can actually have a chart that spells out who's fulfilling these roles now in your institution, but be prepared to update those regularly as there is staff turnover. But don't feel hung up either if you don't have enough people to fulfill a response. I want you to start thinking about who would help you if there is a response, who would fill in some of these roles. I always customize this flow chart and this workflow, however you want to say it, based on the institution. You need to start thinking about who would fill any role and what you would call them and how it would work. And there's no wrong answer. The only wrong answer is not to prepare. So I'll go a little bit more into instant command system, but I just want you to see what one kind of looks like. You don't have to do this one. Do one that works for you. Also, once they know their roles, they have to understand their responsibilities. So usually once I've taken all the titles from here, I start writing out what their responsibilities are. And it doesn't have to be long, beautiful paragraphs. Little just list is perfect. Having a list is actually easier for people to read, and they are very clear on their responsibilities. So this is just an example from one that I've written to let you kind of see what that looks like. But each person needs to understand the responsibility. So if I go to you and I say, hey, you're now the logistics coordinator, that should be almost all I have to say to you. You can now go to the emergency plan and look at what the logistics coordinator's roles and responsibilities are. So that's sort of what it does, makes people understand what exactly it is they're going to be doing. So here I am talking about ICS, and like it's just the easiest thing in the world, but ICS actually can be quite complicated. Um, it's a whole other 3-hour lecture to learn really a lot about ICS. So I can't go into it too much, but I want to encourage you to look into taking this training from FEMA. It's free. It's IS 100C, Introduction to the Incident Command System. It's about a 3-hour training. There is a test you can take at the end to get a certificate, but you don't have to take the test if you're not really fighting for a certificate. I just want to make you all aware, but it is absolutely 100% free. And if you really find you enjoy the incident command system, you can take IS 200, IS 700. You can just keep going until you're an absolute expert in the incident command system. The other resource I wanted to mention to you is the book on the right, Implementing the Incident Command System at the Institutional Level. This is written by David Carmichael, and it specifically takes the training from FEMA and customizes it for the cultural institution. Very simple, as it says in the title. I would recommend you take the FEMA training, then you get the book. The book is available for purchase at lulu.com. It is also available on Amazon, but it's about 3 times more expensive on Amazon. So highly recommend you get either one of these. I should mention the incident command system is used, as I said, federally, state level, local level emergency responders. And one of the great things about the incident command system is it's scalable. So if you have an emergency where you have to call in the fire department, you immediately fall underneath the fire department's incident command system. So you need to understand your role with them. And then if the emergency is just small, like a pipe leak inside of your institution, you can set up your incident command system inside your institution. So it's very scalable. It works, and its whole purpose is to control chaos. I sometimes get a little overexcited when I see a good incident command system on crime shows or Star Trek or anything like that. I'm like, wow, that's a good incident command system. What a great example. So once you start doing these trainings, you'll actually become more aware of these hierarchies happening just sort of naturally. If you don't want to take the 3-hour training and you don't want to read the book, there is a incident command system training on the American Institute for Conservation's YouTube channel called Exercise Without Leaving Your Seat, Practicing the Incident Command System at the Institutional Level, because it is by the man who wrote the book, David Carmichael. It is only an hour long, and it just sort of walks you through the most basics. But again, would really encourage you to kind of look at it all, because understanding the incident command system will seriously help you respond to an emergency. Another people-focused thing is safety. Safety is my biggest bugaboo when it comes to responding to emergencies. So I always want people to put in an emergency plan your basic safety protocols, and even some sort of guidelines that if people aren't being safe, they can be dismissed from the emergency. I have seen too many people go to the hospital during a minor emergency because they did not take basic safety precautions. Again, safety training is a whole other hour, 2-hour constant training. So I can only briefly go into it now, but again, give you resources to prepare this section of your emergency plan. So part of understanding what to put in your emergency plan is identifying the risk to people and then implementing controls. So think about what can harm me. You can do this through an exposure assessment or a job hazard assessment, but the more training you do on safety, the more this becomes natural. I can walk into a flooded museum and know that I need, water protections, eye splash protection, foot protection. If a structure looks unstable and it's above my head height, I know to grab my hard hat, steel toe shoes, and more. It becomes sort of second nature of what type of safety stuff you need. So PPE is the most minimal thing you can do to protect yourself. Otherwise, you can come up with a hazard communication program. And what I mean by this is many of us have in our collection toxic objects, things that are made of asbestos, cardamom, um, radium. All this stuff is safe when it's just sitting inside of your cabinets. But if it was infiltrated by water or shaken loose by an earthquake, you now have a hazard in your building. This can include any sort of conservation material or any other chemicals. Once they get into the water or get disturbed, they can become more hazardous. One time there was a flood at a museum and they had a huge collection of radium dials, and the water actually tested very high for radium. And knowing that that hazard was there, that test was able to be performed before people ran in, and they were able to put on the very appropriate PPE, which is almost a full hazmat suit, or to have it cleaned up by professionals before they could even get to the objects. You also need to understand that electrical and gas safety are huge. Another museum I had to respond to at one time, talking to the director, he said, "Oh, I was so worried about my museum. I just ran in to see what was wrong." I was like, "You could see water was in foot deep in your museum. You did not check to make sure the electrical was off or the gas was off, which could have ultimately have caused him extreme harm, if not death." I know we think when there's a hurricane, electricity is just off, so we're safe. But you do not know when that electricity is necessarily going to come back on suddenly. And I don't want you standing in knee deep water. Prepare for that. So it's better to shut off your electrical, even if you don't have any electricity, so it doesn't come on suddenly while you're standing in water. Same with the gas. And another way to mitigate the risk is just to train, constantly doing trainings, constantly doing, you know, not only for PPE, but also training on how to respond to emergency. You just get better at it and your risk will be mitigated. And I'll go into trainings a little bit more later because that also should be included in your emergency plan. As you can tell, I take safety very seriously since I talk about it for so long. So you should also listen to the plan, as I said, basic safety gear, basic safety protocols. You should always, when you respond to emergency, I don't care if it's 100 degrees, wear long pants, long sleeves, and closed-toed shoes. Even in high heat, this protects you from heat exposure, protects you from abrasions. So it's important to be fully clothed at all times. Gloves, as we know, are fairly used a lot in the museum world, but they're not used on paper products. However, if you are responding to an emergency, I can promise you that water probably is contaminated with something. The object probably has some sort of asbestos debris on it if it was, an earthquake was shaking. So it's better just to wear gloves, even if it's paper. Because at this point, as I said, life safety always comes first. And then based on the situation and your training on safety, you will know whether to put on hearing protection, hard hats, visibility clothing, full Tyvek suit, respirators. All this will become easier for you the more you train on safety and the more you read up on it. But the basics are the long pants, long sleeves, closed-toed shoes, and gloves. Always have that. If you show up at my site and you're not wearing these, you will be asked to go. It's not worth someone getting hurt, because if someone got hurt and you had to stop the salvage while an ambulance came in or had to take efforts to save them, you've created a complex emergency, and that just makes everything a lot harder. So resources. I just want to make sure you have all the knowledge available to you to start putting this stuff into your emergency plan, but also to be prepared. Most people know of the CDC and NIOSH. They actually have a whole section on emergency response resources. No matter the size of your emergency, you immediately fall underneath the safety of an emergency responder. You have to know which PPE to wear. So it's very appropriate for you to look at this. The other one, of course, is OSHA. OSHA has, again, tons of resources for emergency responders and their type of safety equipment. So all these resources are available to you. You can go deep into their websites, get tons of information. The CDC has amazing graphics that show you how to properly don and doff face masks, which I was hoping the pandemic would make people be better at, but I still see this happening, them being put on incorrectly all the time. My final resource I want to suggest is the health and safety for museum professionals. This talks a lot about just the toxins and the unsafe nature of collections in general, not necessarily a lot about emergency response. But if you are unsure if your collection has any sort of hazards, this book will help you identify them and how to properly store them, and also encourages you to keep a list of them. So if you know that there's an emergency and these objects have been affected, you can not only let yourself know, but any first responders. So OSHA, CDC, and NIOSH, completely free. You'll have to purchase the Health and Safety for Museum Professionals book. So another thing I want to talk about for people focus is emergency procedures. This is your most basic emergency procedures. And what I mean by that is, you know, what to do if you're being evacuated, what do you do if a hurricane is coming, and things like that. If you have a larger parent organization where this is already written out, that's great. And you just need to mention it and do a quick summary in your emergency plan. But if you don't have one, this is a perfect place for it to be. And again, life safety comes first. So you need to be very conscientious of that and not tell people to run back in and grab objects during the middle of a hurricane or a fire. Very discouraged. So there's many different ways that emergency can happen. You might arrive at a museum, arrive at emergency, and that emergency can look several different ways. So what I mean is, let's say a hurricane is coming. You know that threat is looming. So you know you've got to do something. So you need to have an emergency procedure of what you're going to do if the threat is imminent or the threat is there, but the emergency actually hasn't happened yet. There's also several times you can be first on the scene. You walk into your storage room and there is an inch of water because the pipe has been leaking for several hours. You are the first person on the scene. What do you do? That needs to be laid out and made very clear. And then sometimes you're in a building when an emergency happens, such as a fire or, tornado, something like that, but you're in the building. What do you do? And then finally, especially if there's like a fire in the middle of the night, because as we know, most emergencies happen when we're not there, the first responders will probably be the first on the scene. So you show up after the first responders are already there, and you have to learn how to work with them to get the information you need. So an emergency can happen when you're in any of these states. But what you need to prepare under each of these arrivals is, what do you do initially? What's going to happen at those first 10 crucial minutes? What is your initial response? You also need to prepare for how you're going to assess the scene. I see people make beautiful emergency kits, and then when the emergency actually happens, they don't have any of the PPE or supplies from emergency kits on them. It's inside the building, but you can't get inside the building unless you have your PPE. So, assessing the scene and understanding whether you can go in or not, and what you need, what type of supplies, what type of documentation, all that needs to happen again in these crucial first 10 minutes of any of these arrivals. And then how are you going to stabilize the scene for people and objects? Calling in first responders if someone's hurt. How do you get your water turned off if it's leaking? Anything like that. How are you going to stabilize the situation and the scene, including secure it, putting up caution tape, putting up barriers, calling in extra security guards. What are you going to do to stabilize? And that also includes controlling the incident. Controlling either your communications, controlling who shows up, controlling who has access to the area. What are you going to do to control it? So this is very vague, I know. I don't want you to all to feel like this is completely undoable, but it's something to think about. And this is why I talk about when you have to have a custom plan and understanding your risk, because you need to know how you could possibly arrive at an incident and how you're going to do these initial 10-minute steps to get everything ready for a successful response. So I'm actually ahead of schedule, which is great. So I'm going to stop here and take questions because I really want you to understand the people focus of the emergency plan.
So at this point, if you want to unmute yourself, and you can also show your video, That would be great because we're going to be going into the breakout session after the Q&A. So again, just go ahead and put your video on, unmute yourself, ask a question. We've got some time here to kind of have a discussion about various things. So feel free to let Rebecca know what you're thinking about, what she's talked about so far.
Any questions? Anything about, I can go into great detail about any of these topics: incident command, safety, initial response. Everyone feel confident? Overwhelmed? I guess there are no questions.
Well, you can also type your question in the chat box if you feel shy. Again, or you can go ahead and ask directly.
All right, so you guys are ready for your breakout session then? You know exactly what to do?
No, we haven't said that yet. Okay, so we've got 4 breakout rooms, and we have about 3 to 4 people in each one. Rebecca, do you mind going to the slide?
Yes.
With the
So yeah, this is your breakout discussion. So I've listed the type of people and what their roles and responsibilities should do, and as I mentioned, you should customize this to your institution. So I want you to think about the people and what positions what roles they would fill if there was an emergency. If you come from a small historical society where there's only 2 or 3 of you or less, think about any outside resources that are also available to you, whether it's the city, first responders, allied professional groups, people who could actually help you respond, and then brainstorm the responsibilities. Everybody in your group is going to have a different type of museum, a different everything. So use your skills and your knowledge to help everyone come up with a nice incident command structure.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So we ended up having just 2 rooms because a few people didn't want to participate in that particular part of the session, which is totally fine. So if we could have a representative from room 1 report back to us kind of what you guys discussed, you know, how the session went, and sort of answering those 2 questions, even though you might be in different size institutions, how that discussion went. Anybody from group 1 was the scribe? Closest birth date?
Which room is room 1?
Okay, hold on just a second. Let me see if I can find. All right, so in room 1 was Brent, Elizabeth, Ellery, Emery, and Jessica.
Okay, then we're room 1.
Okay, great.
I was taking notes. Well, we all found out that we are working at a similar scale, and we have a pretty clear understanding of the chain of command at its very highest levels. And as it gets down to us in smaller institutions where we have to wear many hats, the breakdown comes in with defining which of us are going to perform which tasks, so we don't have any kind of redundancy, you know, identifying people's particular skills and having them know that in advance. We discussed that. We also discussed the problems of being a first responder. Ellery mentioned physically sometimes being too far away, so you have to abdicate your role to somebody else who's actually closer. We talked a little bit about how to deal with hazardous materials or materials that become hazardous, and it seemed like people had a pretty strong awareness of that. Yeah. Anybody
okay,
want to?
Thank you. Yeah. Does anybody else?
Okay.
Yeah. Does anybody else from that group want to add anything? Okay, that's fine too.
You did such a great job, Elizabeth.
That was great.
Thank you.
And then room 3 was Anna, Brianna, Leslie, and Shelby. Did you guys have a scribe?
I can take that. I don't think we did nail that out. We
Okay.
had some difficulty getting our group members in. So we had a variety of organizations in our grouping with a county museum, part of a larger county and system, and then Brianna's museum is a smaller, more focused single media museum, a glass museum. And then I have a science and history museum. So with aquaria and live animal exhibits and things. So quite a variety, but we all did get a chance to look at who would likely fulfill at least those top roles and why, and with some of us, sharing the desire and gratitude for the resources, because some more training would be helpful to prepare those individuals to step into that role.
Okay, great. Does anybody else from that group have anything to add to that discussion?
Well, staying in both groups was fun, and also getting to get to know you guys a little bit better, even quickly. But some things I did bring up in each group that I just want to make sure everybody hears is, when you're thinking about who should take on what roles, it is very common for the director to always want to be the incident commander. The incident commander should always be somebody who is the most qualified, not the highest ranking. When you come up with an hierarchy for an emergency, it can look different from your hierarchy from day to day. And one of the things I love about ICS is it talks about unified command, which kind of makes sure that you follow the hierarchy of an emergency. So if you are assigned to triage and your boss assigned to salvage, your boss can't tell you what to do. Only the person up your chain of command can do, because you're even. Triage and salvage are even on the chart. So you can only talk to the person above you. And the whole point of this is to mitigate not only confusion, but the incident commander is looking at this giant chessboard of all the pieces moving. And if they don't have a clear picture of what's going on, because you guys are exchanging orders at this low level, they can't make good decisions about money, resources, and people. So, there's unified command, unity command. There's lots of great ways that how this mitigates confusion by understanding ICS. And as I mentioned to one of the other groups, if you're a small organization or you don't feel like you have enough staff to respond, this is when you start turning heavily on your allies and your contractors and so forth, because you can find allies either at nearby museums or historic homes or sites, or you can find them from volunteer clubs, sororities, fraternities, Moose Lodge, Kiwanis, Junior League. These are all organizations we've worked with and trained for small institutions, because you deserve to have the same type of response as a large institution, 100%. So this is
Thank you so much for that.
But yeah, this is literally the spot where people get most hung up, is assigning those roles and responsibilities. And I'll say this several more times, this is a living document. You can keep changing it as you learn more. Never wait for it to be finished. It will never be finished. It should be living, breathing document. So
thank you. I think that's really helpful, because I've worked in small institutions and it is hard to find out, kind of figure that out, who's going to play what roles. I did want to say, if anybody has any questions that came out of that particular discussion, please feel free to ask that now before we move on to the next section. And you can just unmute yourself and ask it, or you can type it directly into the chat box.
So I was wondering, we've been talking about training. Do we know, is there like an appropriate amount of training that somebody should have before they are considered well-trained, or say how many drills is an appropriate amount to be run to feel prepared, or is that even a number, or?
It's not really a number. Yeah, it's not really a number. Each institution will have people that are trained at different levels, and you just sort of got to kind of know that. And the best way, ironically, to know that is by doing trainings at your institution. And it can be as simple as doing tabletop exercises, run full-fledged salvage, fire exercises if you want. That again is a whole other training of how to do trainings appropriately. But yeah, there's no great number. And you taking this series might make you the most trained person at your site. And that's fine. I know it's scary, but that's fine. Knowing something is better than somebody who knows nothing panicking. And I have seen directors panic, not necessarily because they're not qualified, but because they also have to deal with, news crews, communication, HR, other issues. And you stop that panic by being like, okay, you are now the communications officer during this hierarchy. You only deal with the press. I, however, am trained in collections, so I will take over this collection salvage. And that's fine. You just kind of have to know, but you find out the most about how people respond to emergency during these trainings. Some people are not good at them. Some people are great at them in ways you never anticipated. So it's hard. There's no number.
Well, I do want to encourage all of you. The last two programs that Rebecca is helping me with as well will specifically be tabletop exercises. So we will take you through an emergency scenario. And what we're asking you to do is to come with your institution. So bring multiple people from your institution, and your breakout rooms will be your institution or your volunteers. Anybody can come to this program for free. So we are encouraging you to come to that so that you can kind of drill that out as a group. Any other questions at this time? Okay. If not, I'm going to go ahead and mute you, but you can unmute yourself during the next session, the next Q&A.
Yeah, so now we're going to go into object-centric information, and it will always feed into that people-centric section. So hopefully some more questions will be cleared up. All right, moving on. So response procedures is primarily what you hear people talk and train about. How are we, responding? The actual physical act of responding is probably the simplest part of a response. The hardest is those initial emergency procedures, that initial response that can really bog you down. A lot of people do not know how to see an emergency and begin the process of starting over, which is why I put that in the people-centric area, was just general emergency procedures, because you need to know how to walk into an emergency and start being proactive. And sometimes that proactiveness is just sitting back and waiting for the first responders to put things under control. That's fine. But just knowing that can prepare you for this next section, which is the actual physical response. So all responses, no matter what it is, and based on your risk assessment, you should know what type of emergencies you should be preparing for. So this is just a brief layout of, like, you want to always assess the scene. You need to understand, what was the incident? What happened? Was it a fire? Was it a hurricane? Was it a flash flood? Was it a pipe leak? Was it someone vandalizing the museum? You need to understand the type of incident. And based on this assessment, you can also know what type of safety equipment and what type of supplies you're going to need. And I know the next series is all about supplies, so I won't go into it too much, but you need to assess the scene. Do not just run in, assess. Then again, we start to stabilize. We stop whatever's happening. If it's a pipe leak, we stop it. If it's a fire, stop the fire. And everything else in between, you start stabilizing, and then you secure the area. And then this is very specific based on what has happened. Do you need to just secure a gallery? Do you need to secure the whole building? Do you need to secure the whole site? Is this a region-wide disaster? How you secure will change based on the type of emergency. And then you always need a category on how to actually now start doing the response, which is to activate your team, start documentation, and then begin the salvage operation. So this is all falls underneath that purview based on your emergency. So I would write out each of these sections for fire, for water leak, water flood, tornado, whatever I need to write on. Each section each incident would have these sections in them. to go over what you need to do day to day. So I actually put an example here of what I've written where you need to assess, stabilize, and respond. And there's also recover down there. I'll go into recovery a little bit later, but you can always add that in. So this is, again, feeds off your risk assessment. That risk assessment will tell you what to prepare for. I obviously, on the East Coast and you down in Florida, don't need to prepare for a volcano. You probably a little bit need to respond for an earthquake, definitely a water emergency, but what type of water emergency? Hurricanes are both high winds and a water emergency. Like, it can go either way, but just having these categories really makes things clearer. So like the sample I gave you on the right is one for a small leak. And it talks about exactly what you do in each of these steps. Listed. I don't do paragraphs. No one's going to read a paragraph and comprehend it during an emergency. These little checklists, numbering, anything that makes things super clear can really help. This is one I actually wrote for another institution, so I had to redact some of it. You're not missing anything important in the redactions. So hopefully that makes sense. You need to know how to respond to every single type of incident based on your risk assessment. And sometimes that incident can tell you you need to do an evacuation. An evacuation, to me, is the best thing because I know for a fact no objects have been damaged. It just takes out that step of triage and stabilization because you're just at that point where you're doing retrieval, moving, and so forth. I chose this picture because I don't know if you can see it. There is a little reflector, and this is at a botanical greenhouse, and they actually put orange reflectors in their plants that are their top priority for evacuation. They've already done the identification, and I'll actually go over a priority list a little bit later as well. So as I said, evacuation is not salvage. Evacuation is simple, wonderful, nothing's been harmed. You can just move it to a safer location. That safer location can be inside your building, or it can be at another institution 100 miles away. I worked with this one organization who for their evacuation procedures, they had an agreement with an institution north and south of them, because depending on which way the storm was coming, they could evacuate at either route. So just people need to think about what their evacuation is going to look like. It's just relocation, documentation, packing. Very simple. And the documentation is one of the most important things you can do because you don't want to lose anything, believe me. So this is not salvage. Evacuation is totally different. One of the best resources out there, again, this is completely free, is the Emergency Evacuation of Heritage Collections Guide. It's actually a pictorial guide, not a lot of words, just shows you step by step how to perform an evacuation. This can help you write up your brief summary, like you see here on the right, but also you can attach this to your emergency plan as a reference, as a resource. For this one, I actually, as you can see at the bottom, I put a hyperlink to it so they can easily just access it if they need to do an evacuation, and it's not an attachment to their emergency plan. But yes, great free resource. It's available in several different languages. So if you have a primarily Hispanic working organization or any other language needed, it's available, I think, in about 10 different languages. So it's very, very handy. Now we're going to talk about recovery procedures. People often refer to recovery as recovering the work from, or the objects from the water, but recovery is actually long term. It happens over weeks, months, years. We're still recovering from the 1966 Florence flood. Recovery is long, long, long. And your recovery should also be resilient. So let's say you have a pipe leak, you respond to the pipe leak. Part of that resiliency in that recovery is that that pipe is fixed. You've now done a resilient change to make sure this never happens again. We often respond to emergencies over and over again and never do a proper long-term recovery, much less a resilient recovery. So I just want you guys to always think about that when you're coming up with your plans. So what does a recovery look like? It is many things. You need to do an after action report. After you responded to the initial emergency and the emergency has pretty much gone away, you're just doing long-term recovery now, write up an after action report. Who responded? Did it work? Any emails that were exchanged about it? Just kind of going over what went wrong, what went right, and analyzing that to put as part of your mitigation before the next emergency occurs. And it helps you, again, respond more resiliently. You also need to do a new risk assessment. Your risk have now changed. Everything has changed because you've had an emergency. So quickly go through and do a new risk assessment. This can be a rapid one, but you need to see if anything has changed. And usually something has changed, especially with water pushing things around, buildings being damaged, and so forth. A risk assessment will help you identify all of that. You also need to do what we call a situation analysis. I do a situation analysis throughout the entire emergency. I always want to know what is going on. What is the latest information? What is going to be beneficial to me, and so forth. So a situational analysis is literally what it says. It's the analysis of the situation. And this analysis can actually go into your after action reports to help you, again, identify things that need to be mitigated and prepared. This is also where you start doing conservation of damaged objects, perform building repairs, replace furniture and casework, so non-object furniture, like office supplies and so forth. And then eventually, for part of your recovery, you need to reopen your institution to the public. That's your mission. You might have another mission, but pretty much getting back to your mission. So that's all the steps that go into recovery, and this can take years. So don't feel like it needs to be rushed. The whole response side stabilizes everything so that you can do a calm and effective and resilient long-term recovery. So hopefully that makes sense. So I always put preparedness and mitigation last, but you could actually put these sections anywhere you want and in any order in your emergency plan. The reason I put preparedness and mitigation last is because it's not needed in an emergency incident. This is something you just sort of keep an eye on. So once you've completed your risk assessment, you now know all the things you need to do to be prepared and to mitigate from an emergency. And I'll tell you now, the latest statistics have shown that every dollar spent on mitigation and preparedness saves you $7 to $14 in recovery. So it's much more economical to do this. So do a risk assessment, identify all the vulnerabilities and weaknesses at your institution, turn that into preparedness and mitigation plan, and then put that into your emergency plan. Yes, you don't need it. It's a day-to-day operations during emergency, but it puts it in a place where people can see it and refer to it and know that this is going to make, actually, if we don't take care of this stuff, it will actually make the emergency so much worse. So I put it in there as this is part of the issue. This will actually affect the emergency if we don't mitigate these problems. So I just want to give you another example of what one I've written looks like. And simple preparedness is all I'm talking about is, getting collections stored correctly off the floor based on, association standards, whether it's Florida Association, AAM, ARCS, IMLS, whatever those standards are, put those in there of what you need to do to make this the perfect preparedness. Doing regular computer backups, make sure your fire suppression system is inspected, make sure all collections are inspected for any other maintenance issues, and then how to store a collection, so forth. Like you can put anything you want here, but what is the basic preparedness and mitigation that you've learned from your risk assessment that needs to happen? So I've talked about all the stuff that you would write probably every year. Like it would sit there for a year and you would just update it as the year goes by. Anything that needs to be updated regularly or frequently goes into the appendix. Sounds counterintuitive, but the appendix, is your information that could change at the drop of a hat, and that way you only have to tear out one page and replace it versus rewrite the whole plan. So the appendix has many, many, many sections, and I've listed them for you here. And I'm going to go over into each one of these, but as you can tell by looking at this is stuff that can change very quickly. Your maps can change. Your priority list can change, forms can change, and you can just grab out of this back section. So think of your appendix as your high rate of change documents. So maps. You need to have a map of your storage space, not only for your benefit, but for first responders' benefits. If a large water incursion hits your collection storage area, ceilings fall, cabinets get moved, it can be really hard to picture in a stressed state of mind what your space used to look like. So having a map that notes exits, that notes areas, helps you find your way around, but also helps you if you're setting up documentation such as grid works, or setting up a grid for a retrieval, or trying to understand exactly what happened, or setting up grids for people to work in. Having a map is incredibly helpful. You also need a map for your evacuation routes. Again, this could change if your evacuation is inside your building or if it's out in the world. You need to know how to get there. And your evacuation routes can change based on road construction, road closures, flooding, bridges underwater, things like that. So having evacuation routes handy to go that you can give people and say, like, this is how you're getting the objects out of here, take this route, very handy. That means you actually, as part of your risk assessment, need to understand your region. You need to know what bridges flood and high water, which evacuation routes is the quote unquote hurricane evacuation route versus one you would actually take, and so forth. So studying the history of emergencies in your area should be part of your risk assessment. And then also have a map of your exhibition spaces. We always focus on collection storage, but a lot of people don't often think about stuff that's on exhibition, and that also needs a map. So make sure that gets updated, especially whenever you rotate out exhibitions. Oops, skip one. Next is a re-entry checklist. This goes back to your safety section. This is that document that you form out of your safety. I want someone to check yes on everything or not applicable before they go into an emergency. You want to make sure, the basic stuff is taken care of. Like, do you have a communication plan? Does everyone's cell phone works? Do you have a buddy? Have you taken care of any injured persons? This is just basic stuff, but again, when you're in an emergency, your brain does not function to its full capacity. So having a checklist to be like, you know what, I don't have a flashlight, so there is no lighting available. Let me go get one before I go in. It seems very like you would know this, but a lot of people clearly have not, as I've seen a lot of people run in, create more of a mess because they didn't go in with a plan. And this emergency checklist just slows you down, or this reentry checklist slows you down, so you know. And this, again, is a checklist you have just printed out in your back, you rip it out, and you use it for each person before they go in. Very simple. Also, you need to have your contacts and your networks all lined up. This goes in the back because numbers, people, emails change so frequently. It's better to just keep this as something you can update every couple of months or when you know something's happened, and not wait for that year review. But yeah, you need to list your institution staff, any emergency numbers, any vendors you want to call, any allies. And I mean, as again, from allies, as I mentioned before, other museums, your professional organization, maybe the National Heritage Responders number, things like that. So think who would be in your contacts and put them there, and update regularly. One of the trainings I always recommend is you practice your phone tree or your communication tree, whether you use text message, project app, or you still use phones. Running through this contact list and just trying them all out as part of a training for your communication plan can actually reveal a lot of people do not notify you when their information changes. Another list to keep in your appendix is collection priorities. Prior to an emergency, you should establish what are your rescue emergencies in an emergency. Loans are usually always top of the list. Then you have your more valuable, historically valuable, not necessarily monetarily valuable collections. But this list needs to be determined ahead of time and needs to be available. This being said, Your collections priorities list also needs to be flexible, because there's always a possibility you physically cannot get to that object that's in your priority list, or you're noticing that that object that's priority is actually okay, but this other one is actually, coming to pieces in the water. It can be flexible, but just knowing what objects are number one on your priority list, very helpful. And the size that can change because loans will change. You might get new acquisitions. It's very easy to change this list. Then you need to go into those salvage priorities. This is a very basic list, just, and I've pretty much put it here. You noted your top priority of a salvage is objects on your priority list. Any objects that are dry or damp that are in danger of coming into more harm. So there was a library flooding where the water was actually only about 6 inches deep. Just the bottom of some books were getting a little damp. But because so many people walk through this flood water, the water actually created waves, and the whole book ended up getting ruined on the bottom shelves of the storage area. And so that's why we normally try to rescue things in danger of becoming wet first, and not necessarily stuff that's already wet. Stuff wet is going to stay wet until you take it out. Stuff in danger, it needs to become a top priority. So that's number 2. Number 3 is anything bleeding or water-soluble inks. So if you have a lovely archive collection, all the ink is slowly disappearing in the water, those become your number 3 priority. Then we do organic objects, complex objects. Complex objects are, for people who don't know, are things that are made of 2 different types of material, an organic and an inorganic. Then inorganic objects. But again, and I think this is a lecture I'm going to do in 2 series from now, is more on salvage priorities. I'm going to go into organics and inorganics and complexes to talk about the material types within those categories and how you would prioritize them even more. So just something to think about and have in your emergency plan. Forms. We always want to do our forms digitally, but I'm sure some of you have been through hurricanes where there is no electricity and your computer battery will eventually die. So it's better to have handwritten forms ready to go. This is a tracking form for tracking objects that I've used before, but I honestly customize all my forms based on which institution I go to help. But your institution, so these forms should pretty much stick. And I normally, in my emergency kit, will put about 100 copies of each form, so that way they're ready to go. So yeah, think about what types of forms you need. This is just one. You would have many more, but they need to be copied and in your emergency plan. And the goal is mainly that you can pull them out and just start using them. Same with everything else in the appendix. Also, you can make them available for photocopy if you do have electricity and you still want to do things by hand. So supply inventory, these are your emergency kits. Again, Elise is going to go over these in the next session, so I won't go too depth into them, but I can tell you having an emergency kit is one of the cheapest yet most effective ways of responding to emergency. You can stop and stabilize things so much quicker. The point of emergency kit is not to have all the supplies you'll need, but enough to get you started and enough to secure the situation. So that's why you have a list. And the list, again, can look any way you want. This is an example of one I've created where I've listed all the supplies based on what they do, documentation, salvage, drying, bins, so forth. And then I have another category where I write down what they're used for. Because again, your mental process kind of shuts down. You're like, I don't remember why I bought these paper towels or these absorption pads or this paintbrush. Well, you know what? It's there. You know, but when you make your inventory list for each cart, you need to list out supply number as well. So there's 14 water dams, there's 20 absorption pads, and that part of that inventory is part of your training as well as knowing how to use everything in your supply kit. Supply kits do not need to be conservation equipment. You're not doing conservation, you're doing salvage and response. It needs to be cost effective and sustainable. So almost everything that I work with is something I can dry out and use again. I don't throw a lot of things away. We recently, as chair of the ARCS Emergency Committee, came up with a new resource on how to get an emergency kit and develop an emergency kit program. And that resource is available for free to download and use to come up with an emergency kit if you don't have one. If you want to see what other people are doing with their emergency kits, the Connecting to Collections Care Facebook page by the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation did 3 15-minute Facebook Live videos where we went to different people's organizations and looked at their emergency kits. So there's a large one for museums, one for libraries, and one's on go bags. And go bags is what I was talking about, like you kind of need to have, so that way if you have to run out, if you're outside the organization when the emergency hits, you have some stuff with you to take in. So check out those quick and wonderful Facebook Live videos. So next in your appendix is you need to have a training schedule. I cannot emphasize enough how important training is. And if you're not setting schedules for training, then you're not going to do it. And this helps with the buy-in that it's in part of your emergency plan, that it's going to be approved by a bunch of people. Great, fantastic. You have a training schedule now. This is a sample from one I wrote up for a client. And I put the type of training, how frequently it should be done, what you're going to learn in this training, and how long the training approximately takes. I can talk a lot about many other different types of training, but for this institution, this is where all that they needed on a regular basis. So think about what you need, all the way down to fire extinguisher training. If you've not been trained on a fire extinguisher, call your fire department and get it done. Easy peasy. They use electric ones now for training for fire extinguishers, and it's kind of cool because it actually times you, and you can have a competition with all your coworkers to see who's better at putting out fires. But yeah, and also think about who you want to train. Who is going to attend all these trainings? Maybe everyone attends all these trainings, maybe a select group attends one, but everyone attends something else. So think about it. I'll tell you now, you always want to include a lot of people and not just make it collections professionals. It's amazing how much insight engineers, facilities people bring to these trainings. I'm always incredibly impressed and learn something new. So the final thing you need to close out your emergency plan is a schedule of review. And this is pretty much telling everyone that this is a living document. This document needs to keep being updated annually, and then updated based on anything that you found that is no longer up to date. Very simple. But it's just sort of concluding that whoever signs and approves this is agreeing that they're going to give you time annually to review this, but also to do everything else that you've listed in your emergency plan, from training to these response procedures are cool, everything like that. So it's important to have the schedule of review and then everything signed off on. You can have just one signature based on your hierarchy. You could have 20 based on your hierarchy. So, just make sure it's signed and approved and you got full buy-in, administrative buy-in. So one of the other big questions I get is distribution. Most people feel like their emergency plans are very top secret documents because they contain your priority list, maps, and so forth. I get it. I 100% get it. But it should not be secret from your staff. Sorry. If your staff are people you trust enough to hire, then they need to be trusted with this emergency information. You can also decide and kind of restrict information based on who you do hand it out to. So like emergency responders may not need your full plan, but they might need a condensed version of it, such as your maps, maybe even your priority list and so forth. Security personnel, again, you can edit it to be different versions for different people. But I have found that keeping it a secret and keeping it confidential actually hinders your response. You're actually creating a bigger risk by doing that than the risk of theft because you gave someone your priority list. It's doing again with that risk assessment, that is what's been determined. I mean, you can print this out, put it in binders, put it on your shelf, look at it lovingly, stroke the spine, whatever you want to do to remind yourself that it's there. Or you can do it in digital format where it's in a shared drive, also backed up to another drive that you can access off-site. However you need to get to it. You can do both options. that's totally fine as well. I've definitely worked in organizations where they've printed it out in a binder and given it to security, printed out and given it to emergency responders, or emailed it to emergency responders. And, I'm talking more about like your fire department, people who would help you like that. But, distribution should go to the people it needs to go to. Restrict as needed, but don't restrict so much that people can't actually help you. So this is another resource I just wanted to mention because it didn't pop up naturally in any of my conversations, but this is a great resource on preparing, training, writing an emergency plan. Lots of great information. Another one of my favorite resources next to the Be Prepared. It's by the Alberta Museums Association. And the second version just came out a couple of years ago. Great resource. I just want to emphasize that this again is a living document. Do not wait for it to be quote unquote done. It'll never be done. There'll always be room for improvement, changes, updates, anything. So if you can't buy all these resources or use all these resources now, that's fine. Over the years, slowly absorb the information and make adjustments accordingly. And after you do trainings, you'll actually realize more preparedness and mitigation needs for your group, and you can make those adjustments as well. So don't get stuck on this must be perfect and this must be done. Just own what you have and start, preparing for emergencies. All right, any questions?
Again, if you have any questions at this time, just unmute yourself and you can ask directly to Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca. I have a question.
Yes.
You had that great stat about saving $7 to $14. Could you give us the citation for that? I think that's something that would be so great to be able to present to leadership.
Yeah, so FEMA every year does a midterm evaluation. Oh, I can never remember the name of this, but it's like the midterm cost analysis or something. You're right, I should have that ready to go. It's
Can we send that to them later, like as a resource I can put in the email?
Yeah, definitely. And pretty much what it does is it does summarize the cost of recovery versus mitigation. And what we have seen over the years is that recovery has become big business. And since in the last few years, it has gone up from $4 per dollar to now $14 to dollar. And that to me is just, you're right, a great resource for saying, hey, I can spend $20 fixing the sweeps in the door, or we can have a $2,000 flood from the outside.
Yeah.
It goes a long way to helping you out. And I've even used it for day-to-day agents of deterioration analysis. Part of your risk assessment again was saying okay, we don't have cabinets, we don't have museum quality cabinets, but we are high risk of inappropriate humidity, which the cabinets would help control. So we can either spend $10,000 on cabinets or have $200,000 in conservation repair. So I've used it for non-emergencies as well, but anticipated emergencies.
Thank you.
I think that's good information for how to maybe get buy-in. So I'm wondering if you have other suggestions for, if you're not the director and making those kinds of decisions to get buy-in.
Yeah, so buy-in is one of the most difficult things. You can have emergencies every year, and being in Florida, you guys have heavy rains, hurricanes, tornadoes, mudslides, sinkholes, anything you could possibly imagine. And still, it's hard for administrators to be like, we should prepare for this. I mean, we survived last time, so it's totally fine. It's not. A lot of this is psychology, and there are a few resources I can, again, put in the email about how to get buy-in. The American Institute for Conservation did a webinar series called Sparking Interest, which is about how to get buy-in from this policy way. And then there was my way, because at the institution I used to work at, it was really hard to get people to take me seriously. So I slowly tricked them into believing in emergencies. I started out by doing posting information about an emergency that could happen to our museum and putting candy by it so people would come by and get the candy, then have to read the sign. Little things like that, all the way to started sending annoying emails every few weeks saying, hey guys, in case you didn't know, emergency preparedness, X, Y, and Z, and would send out like a fun tip. It probably took a while for people to start buying in, like, oh, she's serious, this is real stuff. And then we could start doing trainings, and the trainings brought more buy-in because people were like, oh wow, we're really not prepared, we're not going to respond well to this. But it's all psychological, so you kind of have to come up with little psychological incentives. And like I said, I started with candy. That worked really well. But there's also some great books that just explain how we respond in emergencies and why people don't follow the history of emergencies. It's this thought that like we survived before, we'll survive again. But climate change is making emergencies so much more regular. It's more important than ever that we get that buy-in and start planning. So I'm sorry I can't think of the titles of things at this moment, but I will send them to Carmen to put in an email to you all.
Yes, I will follow in my follow-up email when I send you the survey. That'll be your incentive to fill out the survey, is you'll get some extra resources.
And hold off on the resources till you do the survey. No, I'm just kidding.
No, we're not going to do that. Anybody else have any questions? Again, you can unmute yourself or you can type them in the chat box. Anybody?
I mean, if they can't think of questions now, this is overwhelming. You know, I can always be contacted.
Yeah.
And send more reference information. I have a whole separate hard drive of all my emergency resources, so they are someplace.
Okay. Again, feel free to interrupt me. If you do think of a question real quick, I'm just going to go through a few things. Again, the survey will come out to you in an email. Please just take a few minutes to fill that out. I think it's like 3 minutes it'll take to fill out, but it does help us figure out what programs to offer you in the future. Upcoming programs, we have the next 4 on emergency preparedness and response. The next one's on identifying supplies. Then on February 18th, the salvage priorities and techniques that Rebecca mentioned. And then again, the final 2, where we encourage you to bring people from your institution and kind of go through some of these tabletop exercises as a team. And we'll walk you through that. So we hope that you'll join those. We also have some programs in planning on DEIA, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, that will probably be taking place in the spring of 2021 as well. And again, these programs on emergency management and response are free and open to the public, so please share and encourage other people to attend. Any final words, Rebecca? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry.
There you go.
I mean, I just hope this helps you realize how an emergency plan should be organized, but customizing to your institution is the best. And I know it seems overwhelming, but once you start, it'll be so quick. And I just want to point out that emergency plans should really be short. They should be no more than like 50 pages with appendices, because nobody is going to read a 200-page emergency plan. Not a single person. So don't think you have to write too much. 50 pages is a fantastic amount.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, visit us at flamuseums.org for more information on upcoming programs. And then our Twitter and Facebook handle is FLA Museums. If you're on Facebook, we do have an additional member group site where you can ask, any question to any of your colleagues. And there are a lot of people who are participating in that. It's a great way to sort of just network and throw out a question and kind of talk to people about different questions you might have. Thank you all for attending today.